Well, I think, and this may seem provocative, but I think that it is human nature to stigmatise to some degree. And I think the mechanism behind that is for us to draw back from anything that we see as different. And that could be a child born with a deformity, or it could be an adolescent with a nose ring. It's just not part us. And then that can then move into a whole range of situations where we might stereotype people by their sexual orientation, their religious grouping, and for other reasons, of course, including psychiatric illness. Now that may be instinctive. It doesn't make it, by definition, right or wrong. But what I think happens in a civilised society is people have the capacity to override that innate tendency to withdraw when there's something different or unusual.
Well, the stigma is a huge thing that is actually being overcome rather rapidly, but it's still there. And being involved in the startup of Black Dog Institute at the same time Beyond Blue started up, where one of the primary objectives was destigmatisation. In other words, to get people not to treat us like loonies and people who just pull their socks up or get locked away.
There's a major stigma, probably more in the bush than there is in the city, with people with mental illness. People would be aware that somebody's not travelling 100% right. But because of the stigma, a lot of people won't go near them, and that is a challenge.
It's only been since the 1950s that they've had psychiatric medications, and often, for example, people might be having hands shaking, and that can be from medication. There are some long-term side effects of medication, such as tardive dyskinesia, which is very serious, and that could involve the person's tongue moving backwards and forwards, or their limbs moving, etc. And these are very disabling and very obvious, and often the people feel very embarrassed about those conditions. People can dribble sometimes, and that can be caused from medication, etc. Sometimes if people have been on these old medications for a long time with high doses, it can be very difficult to change their medication at all, and that may cause a rebound effect. In other words, the person will have another episode if there's any attempt to lower the dose. So consequently, they're bombed out on medication, and it's very hard to change things for them, but that doesn't mean the person can't recover. Even people with ongoing symptoms of mental illness are capable of recovering.
Whenever I run into someone who presents as being mentally ill, because you can never be sure until someone actually tells you that they're mentally ill, so there's a lot of prejudiced and stereotyping stuff that happens in my own head anyway. But if I meet someone in any of the work that I do who I think may be mentally ill, I basically treat them like anyone else, because I'm convinced that people are more like me than different to me anyway. So I start with the presumption that this person has a life. He's not his mental illness. He can't be defined as his mental illness or her mental illness.
The labelling of lunatic,
Psycho,
madman,
crazy, insane,
raving,
schizo,
Fruit Loop,
loony,
and schizophrenic. They upset me, because I even hear health workers say schizophrenic, and I have to pull them in line.
Lynne, the woman with bipolar, rather than Lynne as a person who sometimes happens to be mentally unwell.
Once upon a time, I think mental illness was much less known about, and so people weren't labelled as being mentally ill. So therefore they escaped the stigma of the label.
We live in a society that constantly diagnoses people and labels people more and more every day.
Part of the problem with labelling people as mentally ill is that with any label, we put them all in the one boat. First of all, we may in our home visitation meet many people who are mentally ill, or some people who are mentally ill that we will never know because they manage their mental illness. I think that when we're talking about people who are mentally ill, we're talking about people who are obviously in our face mentally ill, so perhaps are not managing their illness well enough. Why don't people manage their illness? because they've missed out on the social supports that will encourage them to see a doctor, see a therapist, see someone who can help them manage it.
When I first got sick, when I first came back to Sydney after being in hospital for 9 months, nearly everybody where I lived knew I'd been in hospital. Word had got out, and one of my friends said to me, "Are you going to have another nut attack?" That's what he said to me, and that was unacceptable to me. I didn't expect to be treated like that. And often the media has been very unkind to people with a mental illness, portraying people with mental illness as axe murderers, psychopaths, etc.
If we're going to have a change in society's attitude and education, it's got to start early. It's got to start in primary school. It's got to be carried through high school, because there's many, many instances where children at high school are persecuted by their peer groups. This has an immense effect on somebody's self-esteem as they're developing, you know.
Sometimes what's even really sad is when you hear a person with a mental illness say, "I'm a schizophrenic. I've got no friends, I've got no job, I've got no future. I'm a schizophrenic." It's really sad to hear that. So the first thing that, one of the things that needs to happen is somehow you work with the person to change their perception of themselves, so that first of all they're a human being and they like themselves. Even when you've got a mental illness, you've got to learn to like yourself. How can you be motivated, achieve, have goals if you don't like yourself? How can you have a go in life if you don't like yourself? Really important, even if you've got a mental illness, even if you might have 2 episodes a year, but you still need to like yourself. It's very important.
I think empathy is at the heart of all of this. And empathy isn't sympathy. Sympathy is where you feel sorry for somebody. But it's a bit hierarchical. It assumes that person isn't good enough or is not up to your standard. Empathy, I think, is much more a parity, an equal situation. And empathy is where you can actually put yourself in the position of the other and feel for them. And so if we allow ourselves to begin the process of understanding what it's like to be that other person, whether it's an adolescent with a nose ring, whether it's a person with a deformity, whether it's a person with a psychiatric illness, then I think you're a long way along the process of beating stigma. And so I think for mental illness, those people who have the capacity to sit down with somebody with a mental illness, listen to them as they tell their story, and eventually put themselves in the position where they're able to walk in their shoes, then I think we override stigma. And we're seeing evidence of it in regard to mental illness, but equally, there's a long way to go.